Hi, this is our group presentation for week 3. My name is Elizabeth Dilling, and later in the presentation you'll hear from my group members Lori and Hawa. The first case study to be presented will be about an event that took place in a small town on the Toms River in New Jersey. Two chemicals, trichloroethylene and tetrachloroethylene, were dumped at the back of Rich Farm in 1970 when companies discovered that the conditions in this town were ideal to dispose of their chemical waste due to the sandy soil, and a situation which was occurring with another company, Ciba-Geigy. At this time, the chemicals dumped by Ciba at Rich Farm and at the town's landfill contaminated the groundwater by seeping into the town's water wells, and numerous negative effects occurred to the town during and after this time as a result. Two chemicals that were found in the tap water after the dumping occurred near the wells in this community were trichloroethylene and tetrachloroethylene, or TCE and PCE. Trichloroethylene, TCE, is a synthetic, light-sensitive, volatile, colorless liquid that is miscible with many nonpolar organic solvents and evaporates quickly into the air. Most of the TCE used in the United States is released into the atmosphere by evaporation, primarily from degreasing operations. It is a non-flammable and has a sweet odor. In addition to mainly being used as a degreaser for metal parts, TCE is also added to some cleaning agents, paint removers, and adhesives. Upon combustion, it produces irritants and toxic gases. The degradation process and the reaction with hydroxyl radicals, the estimated half-life for this process is 3 to 7 days. This relatively short half-life indicates that TCE is not a persistent atmospheric compound. Most TCE in surface waters or on solid surfaces evaporates into the atmosphere, although it is highly mobile in soil, which may result in it moving into the groundwater below the soil surface. In this subsurface environment, TCE is slowly degraded and may be relatively persistent. TCE and other volatile organic chemicals may diffuse from contaminated groundwater and soil and migrate into air spaces beneath buildings and enter into the indoor air, a process termed vapor intrusion. Tetrachloroethylene, or PCE, is a colorless, volatile, flammable liquid chlorinated hydrocarbonate with ethyl-like odor that may emit toxic fumes when exposed to sunlight or flames. PCE is mainly used as a cleaning solvent in dry cleaning and textile processing and in manufacturing of fluorocarbons. PCE can be released into the air, water, and soil at places where it is produced or used. Most recent PCE during its use are directly to the atmosphere. Most releases of TCE during its use are directly to the atmosphere. PCE degrades slowly in the atmosphere with a half-life of about 100 days. When PCE is released to the surface water and surface soil, it tends to quickly evaporate. However, PCE can also break down into trichloroethylene, dichloroethylene, vinyl chloride, and ethylene through reduced dechlorination. Susceptible populations to PCE are those who have high exposures. The most important routes of exposure of PCE for most members of the general population are inhalation of the compound in the indoor and outdoor ambient air and ingestion of contaminated drinking water. General population exposure from inhalation of indoor and outdoor ambient airs vary depending on location. While levels are generally low in rural and remote areas, higher values are found in urban and industrial areas and areas near point sources of pollution. Short-term exposures to high levels of PCE may also pose risk to people using products containing the chemicals in areas with inadequate ventilation. Residing near dry cleaning facilities or storing recently dry cleaned clothes at home can contribute to increased blood tetrachloroethylene levels. In occupationally exposed workers, PCE blood levels have been reported to be many thousand times higher than an unexposed general population. Metal degreasers who use the chemical as a solvent would be expected to have high exposure. People working in dry cleaning industries are exposed to elevated levels of PCE. In addition, evidence suggests that people living with workers in dry cleaning facilities may be subject to higher exposures, even if their homes are far removed from the worksite. TCE. Susceptible populations to TCE are those who have high exposure. The most important routes of exposure of TCE for most members of the general population appear to be inhalation of the compound in ambient air and ingestion of drinking water. General population exposures for inhalation of ambient air varies widely depending on location. In general, rural areas exhibit low background concentrations of TCE as compared to urban areas. People who continuously exposed to elevated levels, such as residents of some urban and industrial areas, people near waste facilities, or people exposed at work are at higher risk. Short-term exposures to high levels of TCE may also pose risks for people using products containing the chemicals in areas with inadequate ventilation. The EPA recently completed a chemical risk assessment for TCE use in degreasing operations, cleaning, arts, and crafts usage. The EPA identifies cancer risk concerns in short-term and long-term non-cancer risks for workers and occupational bystanders at small commercial degreasing facilities that use TCE-based solvents and dry cleaning facilities that use TCE-based spotting agents. The EPA also identified short-term non-cancer risks for consumers and residential bystanders for the use of TCE-containing solvent degreasers and spray-applied protective coatings. Some people cannot tolerate chemical exposures as well. We call these groups of people sensitive populations. They can include pregnant and nursing women and children, older adults, and populations which have been marginalized and excluded from the processes and decisions that affect them. Pregnant and nursing women. During pregnancy, a woman's immune system has to work harder to protect both the mother and the baby. Exposure can affect the health of the unborn baby. Anything that the mother eats, drinks, or absorbs into her body while pregnant may affect the baby's development and growth. If breastfeeding, a mother can pass substances to her baby through the breast milk. Children are more sensitive than adults to chemical exposure because they are more likely to breathe dust and some vapors because they are closer to the ground. They are more likely to put their hands in their mouths, and sometimes they might eat dirt. Infants and toddlers have a limited diet, so they may be more exposed to contaminants that are only in certain foods. Chemicals may pass to a child when breastfeeding. During the teenage years, the body is creating new tissue, particularly the reproductive system. These tissues are especially sensitive to exposure to chemical substances. Older adults may be sensitive to chemical exposure because their immune systems are often weaker. They tend to have more sensitive lungs, making fighting off health effects from breathing contaminants harder. They may socialize less and therefore be less aware of environmental emergencies. They may have trouble moving to a safer place if a spill or chemical release happens. They may suffer from poor nutrition due to lack of appetite or less interest in cooking, which could impact the immune system. Toxic chemicals disproportionately burden vulnerable populations, including low-wealth communities and people of color, contributing to health disparities in conditions such as asthma, cancer, and reproductive problems.
Trichloroethylene and tetrachloroethylene. In 1971, 45 grams of chemical waste were illegally dumped into the rice farms, contaminating the groundwater, which is the source of drinking water for the community. The mode of entry for trichloroethylene and tetrachloroethylene are through the skin, eye, inhalation, and ingestion. These two chemicals cause childhood cancer, such as both leukemias and brain cancer, more significantly found in female children under the age of 5.
Tetrachloroethylene, or PCE, and its byproducts called metabolites are measured through blood and urine in order to determine exposure that could result in health effects. An exposure does not predict the kind of health effects that may occur, but indicates whether the level of exposures are associated with health effects. PCE can affect the nervous system, liver, kidneys, and reproductive system, along with increasing the risk of cancer. 2 health effects that have been associated with PCE are cancers and neurological effects. Based on enough evidence in animals, but only a limited amount of evidence in humans, the International Agency for Research on Cancer still considers tetrachloroethylene to be probably carcinogenic to humans, and the National Toxicology Program also considers it to be reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogenic. The types of cancer caused by PCE are not clearly understood, but in both humans and animals, a long exposure over years may lead to a higher risk of cancer. Studies in humans have shown a higher risk of getting bladder cancer, multiple myeloma, or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Additionally, in animals, it has been shown to cause cancer in the liver, kidneys, and blood system, but because the differences between humans and animals, these same effects are not clear in humans. Short-term exposure to PCE can cause neurological effects such as dizziness, sleepiness, headaches, incoordination, and even loss of consciousness. A long-term exposure can result in changes in mood, memory, attention, or vision. Studies from exposure to humans over the years in both residential and occupational studies have shown effects of color vision and visual contrast sensitivity. Additionally, these studies also suggest that neurobehavioral effects such as mood changes from long-term exposure of PCE. Other studies in which investigated dry cleaners that were regularly exposed showed effects on memory, concentration, and reaction time that continued even after the exposure had stopped. Next, we will talk about the health effects of trichloroethylene, or TCE. There is sufficient evidence in humans that the Department of Health and Human Services, EPA, and the International Agency for Research on Cancer have all determined TCE to be a human carcinogen by all routes of exposure. Additionally, there's a strong link to kidney cancer, along with some evidence to suggest and an association with exposure in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, liver cancer, and malignant lymphoma in humans. TCE has been shown to affect the nervous system when it comes to hearing, seeing, and balance. Both long-term and short-term exposures show similar neurological effects, which include euphoria, giddiness, lethargy, confusion, dizziness, headache, nausea, difficulty swallowing, irreversible memory deficits, along with unconsciousness and possible trigeminal nerve damage. Symptoms of this nerve damage include sensation deficits, jaw weakness, and increased blinking reflex latency. Additionally, in one research study on solvents in twins, there has been found to be an association between TCE and an increased risk of Parkinson's disease. Those exposed were 6.1 times more likely to develop Parkinson's disease than those who had not been exposed to TCE. After going through the long list of health exposures from these chemicals, we'll now talk about what could have been done to prevent some of the health effects that happened. What took place in Toms River had occurred in other places before happening there. It was a lack of government regulations at the time that allowed a company to pollute and contaminate a community and then move on to another community to do the same. The Toms River area was a small town that needed economic support, and it was also ideal for dumping contaminated waste due to its sandy soil. Once companies took notice of this, then it became a dumping ground for not just SEBA, but other companies as well, hence what took place at Rick's farm. If there was more government regulations in place at this time, it may have prevented companies from like SEBA and others from taking advantage of these small towns. The EPA now has the Hazardous Waste Program, which establishes a system for controlling hazardous waste from the time it's generated until its ultimate disposal. In addition, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is part of the Department of Transportation, regulates transportation of hazardous waste. These two departments may have played a key role in preventing the cancer cluster in Toms River had they been established at the time. According to the EPA, criminal enforcement can occur when a company knowingly violates the law committing an environmental crime. The EPA will investigate these crimes, and the company in violation could be subject to felony charges. In the Toms River case, it seems that even when the water company had knowledge that their wells had been contaminated, no one reported this to the EPA and no enforcement action was taken. Also, the company causing the contamination took it upon itself to build a pipeline to dispose of waste in order to avoid further suspicion. These actions, again, should have been made known, and further investigation of how the company was disposing of the chemical waste in the area should have been investigated. As the water company became aware of the illegal dumping and the contamination of their wells in the Toms River area, the company needed to take responsibility and thoroughly test all the wells for chemicals besides just TCE. A full exposure assessment should have been completed at this time. The population and the EPA should have been made aware of what was taking place that led to the contamination. A more thorough examination of the wells and events taking place in the community at this time may have helped prevent continued chemical dumping. The public needed to be educated at this time on the events that had taken place and why the pipeline which broke was needed in the first place, so reports could be made to take into account all contaminants, exposures, blood levels of exposure, and begin to educate the community on their rights in this situation. The way the public health assessment was interpreted at this time for the chemical dumping by both SEBA and at Rick's farm, the case was not considered to be a threat to the public. Had the EPA also been involved earlier for the cleanup, they would have had a more thorough and accurate health assessment be completed, and this could have further prevented continued contamination and dumping in the community. An important step in prevention is advocacy. The chemical dumping began in 1970, and it was not until 1996 that the citizens of the community finally asked for a full assessment of the drinking water to be completed, and the EPA was able to establish long-term testing plans to prevent further issues. This huge delay is a serious missed opportunity. Bringing attention to a community about advocating for their rights was definitely needed in the Toms River from the communities that had had exposures before that. Had the communities that were previously affected by the chemical dumping that had taken place become advocates, then it would have stopped these companies from moving on to new other unsuspecting communities. Due to the long latency period usually that takes place from chemical exposures, oftentimes, however, advocacy is done too late and other communities suffer.
Pros and cons from Toms River. The pros: the chemical company did a lot in the short run economically for Toms River. The jobs they provided were well-paid jobs. The company made the town a place of upward economic mobility and social mobility. The families affected with the contaminant of Toms River are able to reach a cancer cluster deal of $80,000 to $400,000 US settlement. The amount of the settlement varies with each stricken child. Those are the pros. The cons are the company was not transparent in the actions of chemical dumping into Toms River. The chemical company and the water company were not transparent on the construction of the waste pipeline was necessary. They were very vague and really misleading about what had actually happened to the public water supply. Building the pipeline only was not a proper intervention in preventing chemical spill into Tom's River and preventing contamination into the public water supply. Pros and cons of the government's action. Pros. In 1996, when this cancerous chemical was found, all 8 wells of the Parkway well field were shut down. It was the first step in cleaning up the pollution. Over the next 5 years, Union Carbide would install carbon filters on the wells near White Farm, and a settlement was reached. The government made CIBA to pay $92 million for the cleaning up process of the groundwater and to make the contaminated underground water safe. This was a 30 years cleaning up process settlement. Today, Tom's River underground water is clean and safe to drink due to the action of the town citizens and the government. The cons. The decade earlier, 2 wells north of White Farm had actually been tested, and cycloethylene chemical, a common groundwater contaminant, was found, but the government continues to let the people of Tom's River to drink the water unfiltered of the chemicals. The EPA and Union Carbide adopted a remediation plan to let the chemicals go into the public water, into the public drinking water. Supply and curate it out, and then the water will be safe to drink. They refused to install carbon filters on the pipes, which would have saved lives. They did not look for a lot of other chemicals because CIBA was not on the EPA priority list, and allowed the chemical company to contaminate Tom's River and other chemicals like styrene, acrylonitrile dimer, and styrene acrylonitrile dimer, which are carcinogenic. These chemicals contaminated the river for 10 years before they took another look of the water due to increasing incidence of childhood cancers in the community. EPA put less priority on the pollutant, and this is what caused the bad result of Tom's River contamination.
Next, we will discuss the case that occurred in the town of Hinckley, California. During this time, the company PG&E did not properly dispose of or store their chemical materials. Due to this, the groundwater was contaminated and the town suffered numerous health effects. From 1952 to 1966, Pacific Gas and Electric Company, PG&E, dumped about 370 million gallons of chromium-tainted wastewater into unlined wastewater spreading ponds around the town of Hinckley, California, located in the Mojave Desert. PG&E used chromium-6 in its compressor stations for natural gas transmission pipelines. Chromium-6 compounds are genotoxic carcinogens. In 1996, a legal clerk by the name Aaron Brockovich began an investigation into the health impacts of the contaminants. A class action lawsuit about the contaminants was settled in 1996 for $333 million, the largest settlement in a class action lawsuit in U.S. history. Two chemicals that were found in the tap water after the chemicals spilled in through the unlined ponds were chromium-6 and arsenic. Chromium is a blue-white metal that is hard, brittle, and very cohesive resistant. Found as a naturally occurring element in the Earth's crust, chromium occurs in various forms. The 3 main forms of chromium are chromium-0, chromium-3, and chromium-6. Small amounts of chromium-3 are needed for human health. 2 forms which result from human activity such as industry are chromium-6 and chromium-0, which are widespread environmental pollutants. Chromium is widely used in manufacturing process to make various metal alloys such as stainless steel. Chromium can be found in many consumer products such as wood treated with copper dichromate, leather tanned with chromate sulfite, and stainless steel cookware. The chromium compound found in this case study was chromium-6, also known as hexylvent chromium. That was the chromium that was found in the tap water. Arsenic was also found. Arsenic in its purest form is a crystalline metalloid, an element with properties that are intermediate between those of a metal and a nonmetal. It's naturally occurring trace element with an atomic symbol A, atomic number 33, and atomic weight 74.2 that is found in water, air, food, and soil and has a role as a micronutrient. Arsenic is highly toxic with acute and chronic exposures to moderate or high levels through an unknown mechanism of action. It's used in many industrial processes as well as in pharmaceuticals, feed additives, and pesticides. Exposures occur by inhalation, ingestion, or contact. Arsenic combined with carbon and hydrogen is referred to as organic arsenic. Most inorganic and organic arsenic compounds are white or colorless powders that do not evaporate. They do not have a smell and have no specific taste. Thus, you usually cannot tell if arsenic is present in your food, water, or air. Inorganic arsenic occurs naturally in soil and in many kinds of rocks, especially in minerals and ores that contain copper or lead. When these ores are heated, it smelts. Most of the arsenic goes up the stack and enters the air as a fine dust. Smelters may collect this dust and take out the arsenic as a compound called arsenic trioxide. However, arsenic is no longer produced in the United States. All of the arsenic used in the United States is imported. Presently, about 90% of all the arsenic produced is used as a preservative for wood to make it resistant to rotting and decay. The preservative is copper chromate arsenic and treat wood as referred to as pressure treated. In 2003, U.S. manufacturers of wood preservatives containing arsenic began a voluntary transition from CCA to other wood preservatives that do not contain arsenic and wood products for certain residential uses, such as play structures, picnic tables, decks, wood fencing, and boardwalks. This phase out was completed in December 31, 2003. However, wood treated prior to this date could still be used and existing made with CCA treated wood would not be affected. CCA treated wood products continue to be used in industrial applications. It is not known whether or to what extent CCA treated wood products may contribute to exposures of people to arsenic. In the past, inorganic arsenic compounds were predominantly used as pesticides, primarily on cotton fields and in orchards. Inorganic arsenic compounds can no longer be used in agriculture in the United States. However, organic arsenic compounds are still used in pesticides, primarily on cotton. The greatest use of arsenic and alloys is in lead acid batteries for automobiles. Another use for the arsenic compound is in semiconductors and light-emitting diodes. Susceptible populations to chromium are those who have high exposure. The general population is exposed to chromium by inhaling ambient air, ingesting food, and drinking water contaminated with chromium. Some of the other consumer products known to contain chromium are certain wood preservatives, cement, cleaning materials, textiles, leather tanned goods with chromium. Workers in the industries that use chromium can be exposed to concentrations of chromium 2 orders of magnitude higher than exposure to the general population, and workers in some 80 different professions may be exposed to chromium-6. Occupational exposures to chromium occur mainly from the chromate product, stainless steel production, and welding, chromium plating, chrome alloys, and chromium pigment production, and working in tanning industries. In addition to individuals who are occupationally exposed to chromium, persons using chromium pollinate as a dietary supplement will also be exposed to higher levels of chromium than those not ingesting this product. People may also be exposed to higher levels of chromium if they use tobacco products, since tobacco contains chromium. Populations that are susceptible to arsenic are those who have high exposure. Arsenic exposures from drinking water may be elevated, especially in groundwater from areas with arsenic that occurs naturally in the soil, such as the west and northern central sections of the United States. Arsenic exposures in communities near mining and smelting facilities and where arsenic had formerly been applied to agricultural land are public health concern, especially for infants and children. Since arsenic remains in the surface soil indefinitely and long past land uses may be forgotten, people may not realize that they are living in an area where high levels of arsenic may occur in the soil. Contaminated soils pose a particular hazard to children because both hand-to-mouth behavior and an intentional ingestion of soil, pica, that contains metal and other contaminants. Populations at high risk of exposure also include individuals living in proximity to sites where arsenic was produced, used, and disposed. It also includes sources such as smelters, coal-fired power plants, and municipal incinerators. People living in areas of volcanic activity may be exposed to higher levels of arsenic, since high levels are more likely to be present in the environment. Other populations at risk of potentially high levels of exposure include those whose water supply contains high levels of arsenic and those consuming large amounts of seafood and seaweed. Sensitive groups to these contaminants. Some people cannot tolerate chemical exposures as well as others. We call these groups of people sensitive populations. They can include pregnant and nursing women, children, older adults, and populations which have marginalized and excluded from processes and decisions that affect them. Pregnant and nursing women. During pregnancy, a woman's immune system has to work harder to protect both the mother and the baby. Exposure can affect the health of the unborn baby. Anytime the mother eats, drinks, or absorbs into her body while pregnant may affect her baby's development and growth. If breastfeeding, a mother can pass substances such as arsenic to a baby through breast milk. Children are more susceptible than adults to chemical exposures because they're more likely to breathe the dust and some vapors, and because they're closer to the ground. They're more likely to put their hands in their mouth, and sometimes they may eat dirt. Infants and toddlers have a limited diet, so they may be more exposed to contaminants that are in certain foods. Chemicals may pass to children when breastfeeding. During the teenage years, your body is creating new tissue, particularly in the reproductive system. These tissues are especially sensitive to exposure to chemical substances. Older adults may be sensitive to chemical exposures because their immune systems are often weak. They tend to be more sensitive lungs, making fighting off health effects from breathing in contaminations harder. They may socialize less and therefore be less aware of environmental emergencies. They may have trouble moving to a safer place if a spill or chemical release happens. They may suffer from poor nutrition due to lack of appetite or less interest in cooking, which can impact the immune system. Toxic chemicals disproportionately burden vulnerable populations, including low-wealth communities and people of color, contributing to health disparities in conditions such as asthma, cancer, and reproductive problems.
The Hinkley compressor station was used to compress natural gas as it was transported. In 1951 to 1964, cooling water was used at the compressor station and was heated with the compound chromium hexavalent to prevent erosion. The cooling water was discharged to the outlying ponds, releasing chromium hexavalent to the soil and groundwater in the underlying alluvial aquifer, ultimately contaminating the drinking water. The mode of entry into the body of chromium, sex, and arsenic are ingestion of the contaminated water, and also through the dermal route or through the skin.
Next, we'll discuss the health effects of chromium-6, which is the form of chromium that was the contaminant in this case. The International Agency for Research on Cancer and the National Toxicology Program 11th report both consider chromium-6 compounds to be a known carcinogen to humans. The World Health Organization and the EPA also consider chromium to be a human carcinogen. Besides the cancer risk, chromium-6 can also have other health effects on the respiratory tract. The most common health effects of chromium-6 on the respiratory tract is in workers who are regularly exposed. These workers breathe in the compound at much higher levels than an individual would in the normal environment and are exposed at a rate of 60 times higher than that would be found naturally occurring in the environment. Health effects from chromium-6 to the respiratory tract include breathing problems such as asthma, cough, shortness of breath, wheezing, along with irritation to the lining of the nose, causing a runny nose or nosebleeds. Chronic exposure to high doses of chromium can also cause an allergic reaction, which could lead to further respiratory effects, including difficulty breathing. Higher rates of lung cancer has also been seen in employees regularly exposed to chromium through inhalation as compared to the general public. Chromium-6 can also have health effects when ingested, commonly through the tap water. However, there are mixed results and controversy over these health effects. In laboratory animals, these compounds have been shown to cause tumors in the lungs, stomach, and intestinal tract, but in populations living with high concentrations in the tap water, there are numerous gaps in the data making these results unclear. However, because chromium-6 is a known carcinogen and can lead to lung cancer due to inhalation and damage to digestive organs such as the kidneys and liver from ingestion, these associations with cancer of the digestive system make logical sense. There are several health effects that can occur from arsenic. When arsenic becomes airborne, the exposure can be oral or dermal or through inhalation, and when arsenic enters food, contaminates soil or groundwater, the exposure can also be dermal or can occur through ingestion of the contaminated food or water. Inhalation of arsenic dust in the air, ingestion of arsenic in food, water, or soil, or dermal contact with contaminated soil or water can increase the risk of lung cancer, skin cancer, and numerous other cancers throughout the body, such as bladder, kidney, and liver cancer. Arsenic is also known a human carcinogenic, and significant relationship between exposure to arsenic and human cancers have been shown. Specifically, inhalation of arsenic has been linked to lung cancer. Residents that live near smelters and chemical factories that release arsenic or that live near waste sites with arsenic, along with workers at these sites, have been shown in research to have an increased risk of lung cancer. When individuals inhale arsenic dust from the air, it then settles in the linings of the lungs, causing damage that can have short-term effects such as irritation and sore throat, or long-term effects such as an increased risk of lung cancer. Arsenic can also affect dermally, whether it is touched or ingested. Evidence also suggests that skin cancer has been linked to ingestion of arsenic. Additionally, dermal contact or inhalation can lead to another health effect known as melanosis, which ultimately can increase the risk of skin cancer as well. Long-term oral exposure to inorganic arsenic, which would mainly occur due to contaminated drinking water, can cause this condition. This condition causes a pattern of skin changes such as patches of darkened skin, small corns and warts that appear in the palms, soles of the feet, and torso from changes associated with the blood vessels caused by damage from the ingestion or absorption of arsenic. We'll now talk about what could have been done to prevent what happened in Hinckley. Unlike in the Toms River case where a pipeline broke and made the community somewhat aware that a potentially toxic chemical was being used and passing through their town, the community in Hinckley, California was not aware of the pollutants being dumped in the community until many years after the improper dumping was completed. From 1952 to 1966, the PG&E Electric Company used chromium-6 to prevent rusting in their cooling systems as an additive to the water. This water was then set aside in holding ponds which were not lined and allowed the chemical into the water from the water to seep into the ground and contaminate the groundwater. It was not until more than 2 decades later, in 1987, that the water company was even aware that the wells had been contaminated. Additionally, once the contaminated water was discovered, the controversy surrounding the health effects of chromium hindered any real action or cleanup to take place. At the time this took place, PG&E was not being held accountable by any government or environmental agency for how or why they were using, storing, or disposing of chromium. Had current regulations that are in place by the EPA now been established much earlier and tracking and monitoring of toxic substances had been established then, PG&E may not have gotten away with the unsafe use of chromium. It was not until 2001 that the California EPA even began to review the possible toxic effects of chromium-6 due to all of the prior controversy, and finally in 2014 remediation began. It is clear that in this situation, due to lack of regulations and protocols for use of toxic chemicals, along with no oversight by the EPA, that this company was able to easily store toxic chemicals improperly with little attention or retribution for their actions. Prevention of the devastating consequences that occurred in this community could have been possible if there had been oversight by the EPA into the use of chromium, education to the company about the proper use of liners in their holding ponds had been provided, and if the company was held accountable for taking these actions. If protocols were not followed, immediate consequences, reporting, and cleanup should have occurred. Also, if alerts to the water company that their wells needed to be tested regularly due to possible contamination had been made, this could have prevented the continued use of the water. The community and the water company were not aware of the problem in this situation until it was too late, and even then, the lack of evidence of harmful effects of chromium made any effort to clean up the problem very difficult.
Pros and cons of the government's action. California became the first state to acknowledge a link between ingested hexavalent chromium and cancer in July 2014, establishing a maximum contaminant level for hexavalent chromium for 10 parts per billion. The second pro is the sample that was taken in August 2010 showed that the form of contaminated water had begun to migrate, and in September 2013, Cal EPA reported that the plum had expanded to 6 miles long and 4 miles wide, and later expanded to 8 miles length and approximately 2 miles in width. Due to evidence-based effect of toxic chromium to the human body, California forced PG&E to discontinue its use of chromium-6. In 2015, the California Regional Water Quality Control Board, La Regional, served PG&E with an order to clean up the effect of the chromium discharge. The cons of the government's action. California withdrew the 1999 public health goal for total chromium in drinking water of 2.5 parts per billion, citing the 2001 Chromium Toxicity Review Committee decision. The EPA delayed its action until 2010 when it proposed to classify chromium-6 as likely to cause cancer in humans when ingested over a lifetime. Stop. Pros and cons for PG&E company. The pros. Residents of Hinkley filed a class action against PG&E, and the company settled the case in 1996 for $333 million, the largest settlement of a class action lawsuit in U.S. history. In 2006, PG&E agreed to pay $295 million to settle case involving another 1,100 people statewide for extra-violent chromium-related claims. PG&E cleaned up 54 acres. However, it would take another 40 years before they are done. PG&E built a concrete barrier about a half-mile long to contain the bomb, pumped ethanol into the ground to convert chromium-6 to chromium-3, and planted acres of alfalfa plant at the contaminated site to improve ecology. The cons. PG&E used chromium-6 in its compressor station for natural gas transition pipelines. Chromium-6 compounds are genotoxic carcinogens. PG&E dumped the chemical from 1952 to 1966 and contaminated the water in Hinkley. They did not inform the local water board about the contamination until December 7, 1987. PG&E delayed the cleanup of the chemical contaminants that they had promised to do over a decade earlier. Those are the cons.
In conclusion, in both cases discussed in this presentation, the effects of the chemicals due to lack of knowledge of the events happening and lack of regulations to prevent the chemicals made it very difficult to determine the health effects to the community and provide consequences to the companies involved. Also, due to the long period of exposure and the long period before anyone was alert to exposures and other events that could have taken place during this time, evidence of the health effects are difficult to establish. Because no immediate recognition of the contamination that occurred in either of these cases, devastating events took place in both of these communities.